Good evening. Welcome to the Berry Center's Josephine Ardery Foundation Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Michelle Guthrie, Director of the Archives and the Library at the Berry Center. Tonight, we are pleased to present a portrait of Black religious life in Henry County, Kentucky, a research project by the Reverend Dr. Laura Levens and the Reverend Dr. John Inscore Essick. Reverend Dr. Levens is the Assistant Professor of Christian Mission at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky in Georgetown and on the campus of Simmons College in Louisville. She grew up in Louisville and was ordained by St. Matthew's Baptist Church. She now lives in Lexington, where she and her family are members of Central Baptist Church. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Baylor University and a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Theology from Duke University Divinity School. She is currently writing a book, Leaving Home and Finding Home, about the mission theology and practice of Anne Hasseltine Judson, one of the earliest American Baptist foreign missionaries to Myanmar. Dr. Levens' amateur photography hobby enhanced tonight's presentation. As part of this research project, she photographed buildings around Henry County and took portraits of the membership of the congregations. The Reverend Dr. John Inscore Essick grew up in Lexington, North Carolina. He is the Assistant Professor of Church History and Director of Rural Ministry Program at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. He is also co-pastor with the Reverend Amber Inscore Essick of the Port Royal Baptist Church here in Henry County. They live in the parsonage with their children, Olin, Leaf, and Wren. They have bees, chickens, ducks, and Amber says no shortage of shenanigans in the parsonage. Amber and John delivered the convocation address for the initial class of the Wendell-Berry Farming Program, Putting Down Roots, a conversation for the convocation of the Berry Center Farming Program of Sterling College on September 12, 2019. John has a Bachelor of Science degree from Appalachian State University in North Carolina, his Master of Divinity from Campbell University Divinity School in North Carolina, and his PhD from Baylor University in Texas. John has written a book to be published in 2022, The Earliest Church Records of the First Baptist Church in New Jersey. It is part of the Baptist in Early North America series from Mercer University Press. Tonight, they will present the survey and interview research they conducted in 3 Black congregations in Henry County, Kentucky. And we are delighted for them to share their findings in this presentation. Wendell-Berry has said that in its cultural aspect, the community is an order of memories preserved consciously in instructions, songs, and stories, and both consciously and unconsciously in ways. A healthy culture holds preserving knowledge in place for a long time. That is, essential wisdom accumulates in the community much as fertility builds in the soil. Dr. Inscore Essick and Dr. Levens undertake tonight to spotlight and honor the community and culture-preserving work of the Black churches here in their presentation, A Portrait of Black Religious Life in Henry County, Kentucky.
Good evening, and thank you to Michelle Guthrie, Lauren Carlson, Ben Aguilar, and everyone else at the Berry Center for the invitation to speak with you this evening. I am Laura Levens, as Michelle has said, and this is my colleague and associate, John Inscore Essick. Our presentation this evening is entitled A Portrait of Black Religious Life in Henry County, and we undertook this research in response to a call from the Black Church Studies Consultation of the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, a group that I will speak more about shortly. But while we were there, the Reverend Dr. Kylan Gray, who is a Louisville Presbyterian Dean of Community Life and also was then a pastor of a Baptist church in Shelbyville, stated that sufficient attention and reflection upon the lived lives of rural Black churches has not been done. There's simply nothing yet. And so in response, we answered the call to attend to the lived lives of religious people that have not historically been acknowledged or recognized with due attention. As part of this cohort, embedded in the wisdom of the Black church, we were challenged to engage in research as relationship. Over the fall and winter of 2019 and 2020, John and I researched 3 Black churches in Henry County, Kentucky. Through conversations, interviews, participation in worship, and photography, we gathered up the stories and images whenever and wherever the people of these churches offered them. And what we found in researching what some would call the everyday of the Black religious life in Henry County, it ended up changing our own thinking about rural places and theological or religious speech and actions. Home and homebound, for example, have changed in their meaning for us. And most of all, John and I found that our research resulted in a growth of affection for the people of these 3 Black churches in Henry County, the religious places and people they call home, and their mission and purpose. The mission of the Berry Center, and I presume one of the shared interests among our audience tonight, is in building equitable and ecological farming futures based on affection for creatures, for people, place, and for the planet. We hope that in sharing our research with you, that our audience will grow in affection for the Black religious life in Henry County, the people who are neighbors to the Berry Center, and whose churches have been present and a part of the life of Henry County for generations. We hope that you will grow in awareness and enthusiasm for good scholarship that can be done through hospitality, invitation, self-awareness, critical attention to race, and the care and charity involved in building relationships. For the rest of our presentation tonight, John and I will be taking turns sharing information. As a prelude, I will give some background on what prompted us to engage in the research of Black religious life in Henry County. John will then take a turn discussing the geography and demographics of Henry County at large. John and I will then share in offering congregational portraits of 3 Black churches in Henry County that we were able to visit. We will then conclude by sharing some remarks on how our thinking has changed and in the ways that rural places draw people, and also the stated purpose and identity that these Black rural churches hold dear. And so, first, the backstory of our research. So in 2019, in the summer, John and I were invited by Dr. Angela Kauser, who's director of the Black Church Studies Office at Louisville Presbyterian, to join a research group she was forming in light of that year's Black Church Consultation event. For the past 4 years now, the Black Church Consultation has endeavored to build scholarly and practical resources for African American rural ministers, ministries, and congregations in order to help them thrive and to build relationships of trust and power between rural ministers and Louisville Seminary faculty and students. And so this research group of seminary professors, students, and rural Black church ministers met frequently to discuss areas of concern for rural Black churches in Kentucky and crafted shared research questions for different ethnographic study projects of rural Black congregations across Kentucky. So while we were there, we heard the rural Black church pastors from Bardstown, Hopkinsville, Shelbyville, and other areas in our group say that they need resources tailored to their rural contexts instead of urban contexts. We also learned, as the group brought forth their wisdom from the Black church, that relationships are foundational to them. We learned that it is the responsibility of the researchers to look after these relationships, to be charitable and careful with stories. This responsibility of relationship requires transparency and honesty to tell the troubles within the story as well as the highlights, to speak frankly about the valleys as well as the mountaintops. We are thankful to Dr. Kauser, the Reverend Dr. Gray, and the other members of the 2019-2020 Black Church Consultation group for their knowledge and wisdom. We would not have been able to do this research project without them, and we are greatly humbled by their invitation and their inclusion of us. And we were very thankful that the first presentation of this material at the 2020 consultation event was well received and appreciated by those in the audience. And so when John and I were thinking about our own ethnographic study project, what were our goals? And so in making decisions, we decided that we would like to study the Black churches of Henry County as a group. In 2019, there were 4 African American churches in Henry County. And as we are white pastors and professors, and we are not members of any of these churches, John and I realized that it would be a significant sign of hospitality and it would require a good measure of trust from the churches to agree to be studied. Yet we thought a general survey of a county would also be a good lens for research, especially as these churches seem to be connected to one another in so many ways. So as we approached our study, we selected the following questions for research. What is the nature of Black religious life in the rural area of Henry County, Kentucky? What is the nature of rural Black community life there? And do the churches and communities crisscross with one another on a regular basis? And how does the interaction affect the nature of Black religious life? These questions are ethnographic in nature, and so rather than assuming a prior framework or a standard to compare these churches to, we approach this process with interest in what these congregations said in interviews and the history they invoked and their shared practices in Henry County.
We want to take a moment here at the beginning and introduce you to Henry County a little bit for those that may not be as familiar as others. Henry County is a river county at almost the tail end of the Kentucky River. The Kentucky River is the northern border of the county. You can see on the map there, if you zoom in, you might think of Henry County as the middle of the sunburst, surrounded by Owen County, Carroll County, Trimble County, Oldham, Shelby, Franklin counties, all surrounding Henry County. Many folks think of Henry County as a rural county, and in so many ways it is, but by other accounts, other estimations, it is what is known as a metro county, contained in the orbit of the Louisville, Jefferson County metro area, often referred to as an exurb now. So that is a term you might want to look into when you get some time. What do we mean by exurb kind of places? Henry County, by some estimations, is that type of place. The 3 stars on the map show you where the churches are located that we studied, and they're all along a main road, kind of working their way down the county. And Henry County is in proximity to several places that are considered by some people to be major places. Places like Shelbyville, LaGrange, Louisville, Cincinnati, and even Frankfort. So those will be the major population centers that people in Henry County will think about if they often need to go get something, pick up something, or do some shopping, or avoid, maybe, if you're in the mood. The population is roughly 16,000, probably a little bit over 16,000 as of the last count. The new census data will be out pretty soon. The Black population of Henry County is right around 3%, which is well under Kentucky's average of 8.5%. So just over 94% of Henry County is white. And that's well below, say, like Christian County, well below what the population would have been 100 years ago in Henry County, and even 150 years ago, even more. The average age in the county is over 40. Median income is somewhere in the range of $50,000. The poverty rate is anywhere from 15 to 18%, and I know that the public schools, for example, in the county are participating in the free lunch program to help reduce stigma that comes with so much poverty as children face that. And depending on how you count the businesses, there are around 200 businesses, maybe well over 1,000 employees in those businesses in the county. And back in 2019, Dr. Levens and I looked and looked and looked for Black-owned businesses in the county, and they are impossibly difficult to find. We did come across one that our mentor Joe Wright didn't even know about, and this was a man in eminence who called himself the Grill Master, and he sold really good meat on the corner in Eminence, Kentucky. I do not know if his business survived the pandemic, but we asked everyone that we could, and that's all that we could come up with. There are more than 40 churches in Henry County, And as many of you will know, churches are like blooms. They come and go with morning and night. So some records will have as high as 55, others down to 40. Currently, there are only 4 that we know of, predominantly black churches in Henry County. 1 in Campbellsburg, 2 in Newcastle, 1 in Eminence, and 3 of the 4 are Baptist. We were encouraged in our research training to note in the counties that we were studying any history of lynching. And so we did find that Henry County, unfortunately, like so many counties, does have a history of lynchings, and based on different databases that you can search, there are as many as 4 or 5 different lynchings in Henry County, all of those before 1900. And just as a personal note, I really appreciated those who were training us and mentoring us in doing research into black lived experience to pay attention to those kinds of things. Those stories matter, the remembrances matter, and us as researchers acknowledging that really mattered. There are budding efforts underway in Henry County to reclaim black history, to retell the stories. For example, in 2018 and again in 2019, the Berry Center organized with the help of Joe Wright, and as many of you will know, Joe Wright himself is worth a trip to Henry County if you ever get a chance, organized a Get on the Bus tour, and they drove us around Henry County looking at significant black locations, black history, black work, black-owned farms. There was one. And we learned a lot in those efforts about the history of this place. In 2020, we were going to work with the Henry County Historical Society to do a mapping black history of eminence, but the pandemic cut that off, and the Historical Society does intend to revisit that effort in the future. So these are the kind of collaborative efforts, along with research like ours, that are generating relationships, are generating retrieval, are uncovering stories that have been neglected or lost or just forgotten or skipped over. And they are the efforts out of which good history and good understanding emerge.
Yeah. So now a bit about the ethnographic portrait and the photography portrait process as well. So in order to address our question, what is the nature of Black religious life in the rural area of Henry County, Kentucky? We conducted the ethnographic portrait interview process among these congregations. And on the screen, you'll see sort of a step-by-step of what was involved. And so we were able to conduct interviews in 3 of the 4 congregations in Henry County: Campbellsburg Second Baptist, Calvary Temple Apostolic of Newcastle, and First Baptist Church of Eminence. To set up the process, we would meet with the pastors of each church and plan a date for us to visit the church during worship. And so we would worship together with the church. We would not be involved in the worship service. We coordinated a meal with the congregation members. We conducted short interviews to individuals, and then invited participants to sit for a photographic portrait. And so we successfully conducted 35 interviews across these 3 congregations. Everyone who was interviewed agreed to sit and have their picture taken, and we offered to give these portraits to the members of the congregation as a token of our appreciation. And throughout the whole process, we do want to give thanks to Pastor Earl Higgins of Campbellsburg Second Baptist and to Joe Wright, who conducted those Get on the Bus tours, for their encouragement and help with contacting others and get the research started. During the process, the process of taking photographs, which is something that was my job, to take photographs, and I realized that it provided a significant decision point for this manner of the relationship between us as the researcher and these congregations, and the people that we interviewed individually. And because portrait photography, for the almost 200 years since the camera's invention, it can illuminate a person's inner personality and portray a story. However, throughout this same history, there are also countless examples of white photographers who have used the camera to objectify and to stigmatize their subjects, including a great deal of Black subjects and other persons. It is called othering, and it is a shame. And so I realized that to arrive as the researcher with a camera, asking to take pictures, meant that I would need to have a process of care and respect for the participants in our study as I took their portraits, and that is what I tried my best to do. And so I followed the same process at all 3 of these churches. I talked with each person and learned about them throughout their process. Each person was given the opportunity to approve of the photos I took or to ask for more photos to be taken. And so what we did with all of the shots together, that was also on a slide that you may have seen or will see now, is that during the church consultation event, John and I, we put all of the portraits up together, so all 35 persons across with more of the landscape shots of Henry County as one large photography exhibit that I titled "The Door of the Church is Open." That was something that I was really began to meditate on, and I will say more about that later in the process of taking these photographs. And so in the following slides of our portraits of these churches, you will see these portraits of the congregants, some of them, as well as some of the photographs I took of Henry County landscapes. And I hope that you appreciate them too.
We're going to now describe briefly our encounters with the 3 congregations. And the first church that we visited, and we had a third researcher with us for 2 of the 3 churches, Jordan Conley, who's a student of ours and was studying rural ministry that semester. And he was with us at this very first church in Campbellsburg. Campbellsburg Second Baptist was founded in 1848 after requesting a release from Campbellsburg Baptist Church. They were granted a release to go and start their own church, their own congregation. Many Black churches took this opportunity, but most of those wouldn't have happened until after the Civil War. But this was here before the Civil War, 1848, granted a release. As far as I know, that record is still in existence showing the request and the granting of the request to go start a separate church. In several of the interviews, we heard this line over and over, "the church on the road." And you can see in a picture throughout here, you'll see that the church is right there on the road. And we heard a couple jokes about there being limited parking. It's so close to the road and a small parking lot, and so we noted that. But in many ways, being on the side of the road makes them accessible in ways that we would not have imagined. In a place that we might think of as being inaccessible, living right off the road in a rural place, but they found makes them more accessible to people in need. They are easy to find. They are pointed out, they are referenced in conversations in the community that if you need help, go to the church on the side of the road. They are a stone's throw from the interstate. So this proximity, being a church on the road, sort of worked its way through our conversations and was a part of this church's identity. So the side of the road looks like a liability on the one hand, but makes them easy to find, shapes their mission, if you will. Campbellsburg Second Baptist has a residential pastor. It is the only church in the county, Black church in the county, that has a residential pastor. Earl Higgins has been there for quite a while. Reverend Higgins works out of the county, and the young people that are in the church are primarily associated with Reverend Higgins' family. Campbellsburg Second Baptist is the only the church that we studied that has a cemetery attached to it on the backside of its property. They are proud of it, and it is a beautiful cemetery. Multiple times in this church during our interviews, almost every single person talked about the church being a place of welcome, over and over and over, being a place of welcome, a place of care, a place of openness regardless of who walks through the door. There again, the church on the side of the road, the doors are open. When we asked them, and we asked each person in each church that we interviewed, what would you like others to know about your congregation. And they said that you are welcome here. You will be cared for here. And that's one of the reasons that they tend the flame in the little church on the side of the road in Campbellsburg.
Thanks. All right, the second church that we visited is called Calvary Temple Apostolic Church. Calvary Temple was the most recently founded church that we studied. It is located in Newcastle, Kentucky, which is about 9 miles south of Campbellsburg Second Baptist. Calvary Temple was founded in the 1950s or the 1960s as a Pentecostal church. And it is currently affiliated with the First Apostolic Council of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World. Now, the founding pastor of Calvary Temple was a woman called Sister Aldridge. Now, her husband was also a pastor of a sister congregation about 5 miles down the road in Eminence. And according to the current members, when it was founded, this church, Calvary Temple, was an all-white church. And so the history of how Calvary Temple became an integrated congregation in Henry County and then a predominantly African-American congregation all revolves around the story of Sister Foree and her children. And so the story of Sister Foree is very important to the congregation. And so I will try to tell it to you as it was told to us. Now, shortly after the church was founded, Sister Foree came to the church and wanted to worship there and brought her children with her. Now, the congregation was white, and Sister Foree and her children were black. And in the 1950s and 60s in Henry County, that was, and I quote them, against the law. Now, the church members do not know if integrated church was officially illegal, but it was definitely a dangerous and forbidden act at the time. But the church took Sister Foree and her family in, and they became a secretly integrated congregation. In the early years, Sister Foree would come to worship a little bit late, and then the church would smuggle her out a little bit early before worship ended, and no one on the outside would know they were an integrated church. Now, over the years, it became less of a secret, and they became open about being integrated, but Sister Foree's family remained the only black family in this congregation. Now, according to the congregation, a few years later, the church actually closed its doors entirely and merged with Brothers Aldridge's church down in Eminence. The church merger didn't go well, apparently, and so the members decided to reopen Calvary Temple in Newcastle, and when they did so, they decided to call a man named Jesse G. Foree, which was Sister Foree's son. Now, at the time, Jesse Foree was worshiping and ministering alongside his brother, Elder William P. Foree, at the Greater Bethel Temple in downtown Louisville. But Jesse Foree answered the call and became the second pastor of the church. Now, at that time, Calvary Temple became a majority white church with a black pastor and his family. And so the members showed us a picture of all of the families at the front of the church. And you can see Jesse Foree behind the pulpit and the rest of the congregants surrounding it. And so Jesse Foree pastored for 8 years before he retired, and the church has stayed open ever since the Forees returned. And so now, what is Calvary Apostolic like today? Well, when we visited in late 2019, there were 6 persons present at worship. They were all related to one another, and none of them lived in Henry County. The current members all lived in Oldham County, and they drive about 20 minutes across the county line to worship together. The day we visited, they were holding a combined group Bible study and worship service. We studied the topic of pastoral leadership transition and the story of David and Solomon very, very intensely. After the worship service had finished, and we were sitting and getting to know one another, John and I asked as respectfully as we could, why do you come to worship here every week? Of all the choices, your whole family, why do you travel and worship here when to us, as outside observers, the church looks a little out of the way for you? And you know what? That was the question that this congregation wanted to be asked. The story of the Sister Foree and her family, that is when it began to be told to us. And the entire congregation, as a group, was involved in telling of the whole story. And so they continued that story on to the present and told us how the current pastor, Pastor Doris Harris, continues to fulfill the family calling. And so because now if we go back, when Jesse Forey pastored the church, he married a woman named Dorothy Thomas, and this was Pastor Doris's aunt. And so after their marriage, Doris, as a child or a young adult, began attending Calvary Temple and continued to worship at that church after he retired. During Jesse Forey's pastorate in the 70s, the church had become more integrated, and after he retired, they called their third pastor. And that third pastor served for 10 years before he split the church over an indiscretion that we didn't know what that was. And so when this pastor finally resigned his position, though, he came into church right before worship one Sunday morning, announced he was leaving, and then said, "Who's coming with me?" And then he split the church again. And so after 2 church splits, the Calvary Temple was left in disarray, its congregation was torn, and it was without a pastor. And so when Pastor Doris Harris described the scene, she said, there was no one to get up and do the work of the pastor. We were at Sunday worship when he did this. So I just got up and started leading worship. Someone had to get up and start leading worship. And so Doris had been serving as an associate minister at the time, although she hadn't attended school or seminary for formal training. Now, after the church split, Doris acted as interim pastor. She made sure the church was open 3 days a week for 4 services. The congregation was down to about 35 or 40 people. It was an older congregation by then with less financial means. However, during that interim period, Calvary Temple had visiting preachers from the denomination, and after a year of those visiting preachers, the denomination urged the church to call a new pastor. According to Pastor Doris, the denomination sent 3 men who were looking for a church and asked Calvary Temple to consider one of them as a pastor. But during this meeting, a man who was a white congregant stood up and said, "Well, how about Doris? We already have Doris. She's already here." And Doris said to us, "That is not what I intended at all. That was not my plan, but that was the family calling. The Foreys have always taken care of the church." Pastor Doris has been the pastor there for almost 20 years now. The older congregation has continued to age. Calvary Temple has been an integrated church until the last few years as members have died. And though small, though, Calvary Temple Apostolic is a living, active church. The Forey family has continued to lead this church, and they really do see it as their collective calling to come and have the church doors open. That is what they sacrifice and serve to do. And now the third and final church we visited was First Baptist Church of Eminence, which is 5 miles south of Newcastle and 13 miles south of Campbellsburg. Eminence is the largest town in Henry County with an estimated population of about 2,500 people. And there are also 2 different origin stories for this church. According to Reverend Charles Duncan, who is the current pastor of First Baptist Eminence, the church was founded in 1865 when people began gathering at a place called Needmore Alley. According to a 1943 history book, however, celebrating the Diamond Jubilee of the General Association of Baptists of Kentucky, it says that the First Baptist Church of Eminence was organized the next year in 1866 by 3 local pastors, Reverends Taylor, Mack, and Brown. The church met in an abandoned stable, this story says, until it was able to build its first building, but on its own. And now the early records of this church have been lost, but as one story begins with the gathering of people, and the other begins with the organization of the church by local pastors, it is possible that both stories may be true. Now, the most important figure in the history of First Baptist, according to its current members, is the Reverend W.H. Goatley, Sr. Reverend Goatley pastored the church from 1958 to 2003. Reverend Goatley became the pastor at the age of 28 when the prior pastor was elected president of Simmons College in Louisville. Reverend Goatley shepherded the church through major events, including the civil rights movement and the building of the current church building. Pastor Goatley organized cars that traveled from Henry County to Frankfort in 1964 to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak at a rally. He was also present in a meeting in Louisville where local pastors gathered to meet Dr. King and talk to them alone. Reverend Goatley also designed all the stained glass windows in the sanctuary, some of which we have showcased in this lecture and appeared on the Henry County paper this morning. Now, today, First Baptist Church of Eminence is the largest primarily African American congregation in Henry County. When we visited on a very cold and icy Sunday before the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, there were about 55 persons present for worship. First Baptist Church seems to have absorbed congregants and members from other Black churches in Henry County that are now closed as people have moved and aged and wandered. Yeah. And so this church is now a mix of community members and commuters. So Pastor Charles Duncan and his wife, they live in Shelbyville, and other congregants commute into Eminence for worship as well, some from rather long distances. Some of the members who are community leaders in Henry County are also commuters, although they grew up in Henry County. Other members are community leaders and Henry County residents, though they may have worked outside the county. Joe Wright, who we have mentioned several times by now, is also a member of this church, and he has always lived in Henry County, but worked outside of Henry County for his whole career. Another congregant grew up in First Baptist Church Eminence, has been a longtime member, and devotes herself to taking care of the church and the community. As a volunteer, she takes care of the sick, drives the bus, cares for the children, and otherwise does what she can to strengthen connections between the church and community as an extension of her devotion to God. First Baptist Church also wants to be known as a welcoming congregation. One congregant said, "It is my church, our church, God's church. We are blessed because we have members that literally care about each other. When one member suffers, we all suffer." Part of their commitment to welcome is connected to Reverend Goatley's legacy. And so the concept of welcome at First Baptist Church of Eminence is also closely tied to justice and a conviction of human dignity for all people. Now, in the future, John and I would like to continue researching these churches. COVID kind of walloped us on this, and we would love to be able to visit and interview with the fourth Black church of Henry County, which is Main Street Baptist Church in Newcastle, if possible, in the future. There were so many connections and questions for further study that are beyond this presentation that we would like to pursue to add to these congregational portraits of Black religious life in Henry County. As we were doing our research and thinking about the mission of the Black Church Consultation to build resources for African American rural ministries, and congregations, we both have some concluding thoughts based on our research. The first, which is mine, is that the importance of paying attention to how the importance of paying attention to how the people of the congregation expressed and acted upon what they believed the purpose of their church's existence to be. One thing I noticed in this research is that theology is lived and practiced as much as it is taught and preached. When we visited worship services and then asked the congregants what they most appreciated about their church and wanted others to know, they talked and acted in theological ways as they expressed themselves. Now, we have discussed throughout these portraits that all of these churches describe themselves as welcoming and inviting. What I have realized throughout this process is that for these rural congregations especially, there are several theological layers to the meaning of welcome. It can mean a welcome like that of family or close relationships. It can mean a welcome of strangers, regardless of status. It can mean a welcome of care and concern for one's welfare. It can mean a welcome that offers to be a bridge or a conduit between every person and an encounter with God. It can mean a welcome that enacts justice as a prophetic sign of universal human dignity and worth. It can mean a welcome that testifies to the very character of God. All of these layers of meaning are bound up within the reason these churches understand their reason for being in Henry County in this place and time. It is wrapped up in what they mean when they say, "The door of the church is open." These congregations take all of this seriously and would be greatly benefited by resources that address all of these meanings of welcome in a rural context like theirs.
Finally, we want to talk a little bit, a couple insights specifically related maybe to the rural element of some of these things that challenged and changed our thinking. And in 2019, when Dr. Calzer asked us as we were preparing for all this research, what does rural mean? At the time, I thought, and still do think, that is a loaded and impossible question to answer briefly. But these churches, this place, all provide an example, or three examples, if you will, definitions. Not all-encompassing definitions, but definitions, examples of what rural can mean in a place. And three things to leave you with on that. One, we were really challenged to rethink what we mean by homebound. When I was growing up in a religious context, homebound people were folks who couldn't get out of their house for illness, injury, age, whatever it would be. Homebound meant somebody who was unable to leave. But as we learn in our research, homebound can also mean people who are bound for home. And in each and every one of these churches, most of them, in fact, who worship there week after week in the religious sense of the word, do not live near the church. They are homebound members. They are members that make their way from other counties, greater distances, who live elsewhere the rest of the week and go there for worship out of their affection for that place. The church may be in Henry County, the building may be in Henry County, but their residences are in Shelby, Oldham, Jefferson, Fayette County. One person drives from as far away as Fayette County. One person said, "God's awesome because I have people asking me, you drive all the way over there to go to church?" But they said, "That's where the Spirit leads me." And so we learn that the rural church, is the draw in this case, and not the church they're trying to get away from, but the rural church is the church they're trying to find, which contradicts the idea that many people have of rural congregations in rural places that we often assume don't have the teeth to draw people. These churches fly in the face of that logic. They are already drawing people back based on their pre-established ties. Those deep ties matter. Strong bonds, family bonds, draw people away from far away places. Similar to other rural congregations, though, if you ask them what concerns they have, you will hear the loss of young people. We're not retaining the young folks. That's not unique to the black church either in areas like ours. Two, and related, recentering rural churches. These churches, these three, are sought out by people. Their congregants drive by many other churches on their way to this place. And they go to this place on purpose, with intention. This raises for us this sort of paradox or riddle of a traveling church. We're seeing a traveling church here. The interesting thing is, I don't think that we need to solve the riddle, but lean into it, live into it, examine it. Churches, denominations, we would urge, who are making Bible studies, resources, thinking about these congregations, need to pay more attention to the ways these streams are running. People aren't always just running away from rural churches. This raises interesting questions for me, particularly as a rural leader of a congregation. What do you do, for example, if a lot of your members who you rely on to keep a church going don't live nearby, can't run into the church building quickly to cut a light off or cut the air down or meet the maintenance person or lead a ministry? How do you lead people who worship with you on Sundays in Henry County but live in Jefferson County perhaps the rest of the week to be active? And so that is a big hurdle that we noticed as well in these predominantly black churches. And finally, the ties that bind. There's a lot of family ministering and a lot of ministering to families. We found connections and cooperation all over the place. I think over and over again, you pull on a thread in Newcastle and things from Campbellsburg and Eminence come tumbling out. Cooperation between churches, cooperation among churches, family members all over the place, so many family connections that we had to really work hard to try to keep those lines in place. Reverend Dr. Kylan Gray, who was a longtime pastor of a black church in Shelby County, said that, quote, "We pastor each other's cousins," end quote. And we found that to be quite the case. Family pastoring together, pastoring your family members. There's a lot rolled up in ministering to and with your own family. I just think of Calvary Apostolic, what that is like, pastoring with and for your own family. And it seems to us like the ministerial leaders in these churches could benefit from resources and thinking to help them navigate these waters. And finally, we want to point out what we discovered, which has just really piqued our interest, something we're calling Revival Road. There is an 8-church revival that's been going on for a really long time, and it involves churches from Henry County, black churches from Henry County and Shelby County, across the line, and they rotate around each year. These churches do hosting for a night. They go to a different church on this Revival Road between here and Shelby County, and they're doing church together, doing revival together, holding those ties that bind. And we believe that that revival and its history alone is worthy of a research project, maybe even a documentary, but that is stuff for down the road. So this is our portrait of black religious life in Henry County. We want to thank you for your time this evening and for listening to us. Good night.